Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Late to the Party by Rami Vance and Michael Anderle, narrated by Noah Michael Levine. 1. Beneath the streets of Elishir were catacombs that stretched far beyond the reach of the city. It was said that they were created thousands of years before the elves moved to the realm. They'd been carved out by creatures who slunk in the darkness, etching their likenesses into the cold, wet stone, groping about in the darkness as if they were looking to find some kind of meaning or perhaps create their own. The catacombs were left untouched for thousands of years, the smell of death festering in their walls as those who were entombed rotted away, along with the subsequent civilizations that had risen and fallen. The current residents of Elishir avoided the catacombs. They dumped their shit in them and left it at that. It was this shit that the Mundanes were trekking through. Robert Suzuki Fletcher led them down the claustrophobic corridors. He held a torch that cast a flickering light across the smooth sandstone. He wore tight-fitting leather armor he had picked up a few weeks ago that was decorated with 2 sets of runes. The purpose of the runes had been lost on him, but he had been told they might be helpful. His helmet hid a scarred and burned face covered in stubble. His short sword was chipped, and his shield was covered in basilisk hide. Stu followed closely on Suzuki's heels. He was a hulk of a man whose true nature was betrayed only by the softness of his acne-scarred face. His eyes rapidly searched the darkness, and he gripped his torch so tight that his fingers were nearly as white as the sandstone walls. He wore hardly any armor, only a steel kilt. His chest was covered in myriad deep-long scars. What he lacked in armor, he made up in weaponry. Throwing daggers were strapped to his war-painted chest, and short swords, longer daggers, and a great sword hung from his waist. The barbarian seemed more jittery than Suzuki, and he puffed out his chest as if to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid. Still, his free hand hovered over the hilt of one of his short swords. Behind Stu was a young woman named Sandy, whose long hair was pulled back in a braid. She did not carry a torch. Instead, a flame flickered in her open palm. She wore no armor, only an ornate set of robes with embroidered arcane symbols. Her feet floated a couple of inches off the ground, her toes lightly scraping the stone floor as she glided forward. She didn't seem to care much about the narrowness of the walls. In her free hand, she held a book which she winked at every time she wanted to flip the page. Stu jogged to catch up with Suzuki. "How much longer are we going to be slogging around down here?" he whined. Suzuki sighed and looked at Stu. "We all spent long enough staring at that bullshit map. You couldn't make any more sense of it than I could. But if you would prefer to be the one leading the way into the caverns of darkness, please, be my guest." "Dude, you know I have that whole dark thing." "You mean being afraid of the dark?" Sandy closed her hand, and not only did the flame in her hand go out, but so did the light from their torches. Stu yelped. With a snap of her fingers, a small fire burned from the palm of her hand, illuminating the dark corridors again. "Nyctophobia," Sandy chimed in with a devious giggle. "Yeah, that," Stu said. Suzuki turned his head so Stu couldn't see his smirk. "Kids are afraid of the dark. You're not a kid. You're a big-ass manly man, right?" Stu looked down at his boots. He sighed and nodded his head. "Yeah, I'm a big-ass manly man."
"You know," Sandy cut in, "it says that the people who used to live down here once conducted human sacrifices to communicate with their gods. The elves say that when they first disturbed the graves, they unleashed an army of spirits who possessed the first villagers and made them turn on each other. And that was when they started to hear the voices coming from the catacombs, telling them to—" Suzuki turned to Sandy, his lips pursed. "Sandy, will you cut out with all the history lessons?" Sandy floated closer to Suzuki and Stu. She closed her book, and it vanished. Another fireball snapped into existence in her open hand. "Why?"
She leaned forward menacingly, the flames of the fire casting shadows across her face, giving her a corpse-like appearance.
"Are you getting afraid too, Suzuki? That maybe, just maybe, whatever was locked down here—"
Sandy whipped her head around suddenly.
"Did you guys hear that?"
Suzuki sucked in a deep breath. "Not funny." He was happy that his helmet was on. He was pretty sure that he had just dropped 3 shades of color in his face. Sandy's smile widened, and all the menace in her face was replaced by a smile far too cute for where they were. "You both need to chill out. These catacombs have been abandoned for hundreds of years, which is why we're stuck with basic groundskeeper duties." Suzuki shook his head. "This is not groundskeeper duty. We're on an important quest." "Dude," the barbarian chimed in, "we're killing giant rats. How many times in the last week have we been sent to dank places like this to kill a nest of giant rats?" Suzuki sighed. "Actually called a mischief of rats. I told you that last time. But these are undead rats, so would it still be a mischief? Maybe something like a macabre or a naughtiness of rats or Suzuki. Nobody cares what the rats are named." Suzuki looked at Sandy for support. Even in the dark, he could see the apathy on her face. "You don't care about the historical significance of the caverns we're exploring, or the fact that we might be the first people to uncover its secrets in at least 500 years. But you do care about what a herd of rats is called? Priorities, man. Priorities." "Mischief," Suzuki muttered. "Mischief of rats." But they were right. Killing a bunch of rats, whatever they were called, was shitty work. Work that Suzuki hoped would give them what they needed to accomplish their real mission: saving Beth. Stu cocked a thumb in Suzuki's direction. "This guy is hopeless. Can we just get back to walking?" The Mundanes started down the dark, winding underground tunnels again. Suzuki was keeping quiet. He didn't want to disclose how frustrated he was getting with the journey. Stu and Sandy were right. These quests, if you could call them that, were nothing more than vermin extermination. Granted, the exterminations were of very large, dangerous vermin, but in the grand scheme of things, they weren't heroes. They were pest control. Their skills weren't being put to use, and to add insult to injury, it didn't seem that any of this was helping him or the rest of the Mundanes figure out a way to save Beth. It almost felt as if the MERCs were intentionally wasting their time. Suzuki couldn't imagine why they would be doing that, though. Milos, a high-ranking dwarf MERC, had vouched for them on multiple occasions. They were one of the few new recruit parties who were qualified to hit the field without any veterans watching over them, and they hadn't suffered any casualties worse than a few sword wounds or burns. Yet here they were, walking through another set of catacombs with yet another terribly drawn map, looking for rats. At least they were just rats this time. Suzuki was still trying to scrub the smell of basilisk shit out of his armor. Stu scraped his daggers against the stone wall, causing a screeching noise that cut through Suzuki's musings. "Do you guys remember that one raid we did, the one with all the worm sisters?" Suzuki nodded. "Yeah, why? Remember how it wasn't nearly as boring as this?" "Fuck, Stu. If you're just going to—" "I'm just joking. Just joking. Seriously, though, I was asking because you brought it up last week. You said you wanted to see if we could find footage for some nerdy-ass reason." Suzuki wished he wasn't wearing a helmet, so he could pinch the bridge of his nose in aggravation. "I wanted to review the video and take some tactical notes. There's nothing nerdy about wanting to make sure that I don't get us killed." Stu flexed, but his muscles were lost in the dark. "Just point me in the direction of whatever you want dead. That's how we're going to keep from getting killed. Anyways, I got the video last night from a homeboy. I DM'd it to you earlier if you want to take a look at it." "Thanks, Stu." If Suzuki could see his face, he'd note that the barbarian was smiling in a devilish way. "And I was thinking, since I did you such a solid, like a good friend does, maybe I'd get the first crack of any of the loot." Sandy and Suzuki chimed in unison. "No." The fire lighting their way flickered, threatening to go out. "No way," Sandy said. "You got the first crack last time. Besides, I'm up." "Come on, guys. You know I need—" "Nope. As your fearless leader, I've been keeping tabs. We all agreed to the rotation. Sandy has first dibs this time, and you're not allowed to say anything until 3 days afterward. I'm tired of you guilting everyone into giving you what you want. If you guys weren't so soft, you wouldn't feel so guilty." Sandy floated closer to Stu, and when she was next to him, floated up, bridging their height difference. Once she was face to face with him, she gave him a peck on the cheek. "Soft for you.
When you're hard, that is.
Oh, baby.
Suzuki groaned. Guys, get a room. And before Stu could say anything, Suzuki added, after the mission. The Mundanes came to a fork in the tunnels, with one veering off to the right and the other to the left. Suzuki consulted his map. There's no fork in the map, he murmured. Stu scoffed. So what I'm hearing is, you got us lost. Sandy, you need to control your man. He wouldn't be my man if he was controllable, Sandy purred. Why don't you just use that find target thing you're always using? Stu asked. One, Suzuki started. I don't think it's a good idea to always be relying on magic to figure out how to accomplish things. What if we end up in a non-magic area? What are we going to do then? Secondly, I want to conserve my mana so we don't have to spend a couple of days down here trying to get back home. And thirdly... The barbarian lifted his hands in surrender. All right, I get the point. So, left or right? Suzuki walked over to the left opening. He strained his ears, but couldn't hear anything. Your guess is as good as mine. Sandy came up beside Suzuki and pulled out her book. She flipped through a couple of pages and stopped. She pointed at the opening on the right. If either of you jackasses had been listening earlier, you would have heard me tell you that the crypts were always built to the right. The split in the tunnel was to confuse looters. Every turn we're supposed to take is going to be a right. There's a lot of them. I guess the idea was that people would eventually get fed up and try a left and get lost. Suzuki looked over Sandy's shoulder, trying to make heads or tails of the scribbles on the page. What language is that written in? Don't worry. I've been using that cipher SD that Diana gave me last week. It works pretty well. I'm thinking about splurging to have the Chipmaster upgraded, if we get a good haul on this one. Why don't you pump some cash into something more useful? Stu asked. I don't know, honey. That Smell-O-Vision SD that Suzuki got a while back has been pretty useful. Plus, I'll get to read more, and more reading means more spells. You've been liking the spells I've been learning, right, Stu? Stu laughed nervously and cleared his throat. Yeah, they've been fun. Gross, Suzuki cut in. All right, right turns it is. They took the right turn, and the tunnel instantly descended, the roof shortening so that the Mundanes had to crouch to continue moving forward. It was not easy going. The floor was muddy and covered with brittle things that Suzuki thought would be best to avoid looking at. Instead, he focused on the darkness beyond what their torchlight illuminated. Suzuki let his mind wander as Sandy made her way to the front of the queue, guiding them through the next series of tunnels. It was nice to sit back and let Sandy take care of something. Over the last couple of quests, she had started to take a more assertive position in what was being planned. It was greatly easing the general stress that had been building in Suzuki's head about planning every step along the way. When Sandy knew something, she would speak up and help out, providing things that Suzuki wouldn't have been able to see on his own. Even Stu was trying his hand at different aspects of questing. The fact that Stu had gone out of his way to hunt down a video specifically for tactics was proof that he was learning to prioritize, even if the extent of his knowledge was defined by how to get the best loot for himself. The Mundanes were not the same group they had been just a few months ago. The hours that they used to spend plugged into Midgard VR seemed like a lifetime ago. Suzuki didn't even feel he resembled that person who had played that game for years. Even the initial recruitments with the military and their eventual poaching by the hands of the MERCs seemed like a distant memory. There was just the here and now. And now, they were crunching bones and shit beneath their boots as they hunted a mischief of undead rats. Maybe a perversity of rats, Suzuki muttered to himself. That might work better then. Drop it, Suzuki, Sandy interrupted. Do you hear that? Suzuki was silent. Sandy pointed down the tunnel. There was a sound of teeth-gnawing wood and a few screeches and squeals. Stu started down the tunnel. Sounds like rats to me. Suzuki grabbed his arm, stopping him from moving forward. Remember what we talked about? Yeah. Save the Leroy Jenkins shit. Suzuki nodded. Yup. Save the Leroying for later. Come on. Let's check it out. Slowly. The Mundanes walked down the tunnel. The walls were built farther away from each other here,
and the ceiling opened up so that they no longer had to crouch. After a few feet, the tunnel opened up to a large crypt. Suzuki rested his hand on the wall. The sandstone had been replaced with brick. Suzuki pointed his torch. "Sandy, can we get a little bit more light?" A handful of small, non-flammable blue sparks floated out of Sandy's hands. The sparks took an orb shape and floated down the tunnel, shedding light on the catacombs' dark crevices. Suzuki had been right. The walls were brick. What he hadn't noticed, though, was that there were crypts dug into them. Thousands of skulls were stacked on top of each other. Their blank eyes stared out as if they were meant to watch whatever was coming to pass. The floor of the crypt's open area was covered in bones, some more decomposed than others, although many of the bodies still wafted the fumes of the dead. Among the skeletons and rotting corpses were rats. They were scuttling about, ignoring the lights that flickered over them. Each rat was nearly 5 feet long, and they were indeed undead. Most of their flesh had rotted off, and what was left was green and toxic-looking. Their hair had mostly fallen out, and the remainder was knotted up in mangy tufts. The undead rats gnawed at the flesh of the decomposing carcasses, occasionally snapping at each other. Their teeth, visible from behind their gaunt cheeks, never ceased moving. Suzuki looked closer. He could see that there were even more rats than he had initially expected. Much of what he had thought were the bones of humans were nothing more than smaller rats piled on top of each other. The floor looked as if it were waving back and forth because of the unceasingly moving, ironically dead bodies. Sandy peered over the edge of the ledge. "Well, there's your mischief." Suzuki sat at the foot of the tunnel and looked out at the crypt beneath him. "Mischief does not do justice to how disgusting that is." "Can't we just have Sandy drop a firebomb or something?" Stu suggested. "All of those rats are pretty close. The whole thing would probably go up in flames." "Not a bad idea, Stu. Not a bad idea at all." Stu looked extremely proud of himself. Somehow, he was flexing as smugly as he was smiling. Suzuki waved away Stu's celebratory mood. "Unfortunately, decomposing bodies release methane gas, and this crypt is probably filled with it, and the rotting undead, they're surprisingly explosive." "So?" Stu stopped flexing. "That's a good thing, right?" Suzuki gave Sandy a troubled look before returning his attention to Stu. "Maybe if we weren't miles and miles underground. You ever see the movie Backdraft?" Sandy made an exploding gesture with her hands. "So, I guess not." Stu was deflated. "So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that we have to go down there and kill everything." Suzuki nodded. "Yep. Any area of effect spells from Sandy are pretty much out of the question, 'cause it'll be too cramped." Sandy pulled out her staff and spun it. "Guess it gives me a chance to try this." "Might as well," Suzuki said. "Let's go." "Wait, you don't have a plan or something?" Stu asked. "I was thinking we could just wing it, see what happens." Suzuki stepped to the side, holding his arm as if guiding Stu over the edge of the ledge. "Stu, please, be my guest." Stu cracked his knuckles and looked around, with a smile as wide as an anarchist's on being introduced to his first pipe bomb. His eyes settled on an empty crypt to their right. He reached in and dislodged a hunk of a wooden beam that was being used to support the bricks. The small crypt collapsed on itself, skulls and other wooden planks falling and shattering against the ground. Stu held up his plank and surveyed it closely. After he was satisfied, he grabbed a few other planks and started working. When he was finished, he had somehow managed to connect each of the planks together so that they made a large square. He scrolled through his HUD, selected hemp fabric that instantly materialized in his hand, and stretched the fabric over the frame he had built before hammering it to the frame. "Sandy, could you cast stone skin for me?" Sandy raised her hands, and they took on the consistency of rock. "No problem." She waved her hands over Stu's impromptu sleigh, and the fabric hardened. Stu picked up the sleigh and looked down at it, satisfied with his work. "Looks good to me." Then he jumped on the sleigh and, holding on, leapt off the tunnel's ledge. He sailed through the air for a few seconds before he fell to the ground, still standing on his structure. The sleigh hit the ground with a sickening thud, sending rat guts and body parts flying through the air as Stu swung his greatsword, cleaving through the closest rats. "That's what I'm talking about, Stu," Sandy shouted. "That's my man." Stu skewered 3 rats on his sword, then held it up for Sandy to see. "Hey, babe, it's a rat kebab." A giant rat leapt from the masses of screeching rodents beneath and knocked Stu into the sea of claws and teeth. Suzuki sighed as he unsheathed his sword. "Guess that's our cue. I'll hand it to him, though. It did look pretty cool." Sandy raised her hand to her face and pulled her hood over her head. A stone mask with sullen eyes and a mouth drawn into a grimace shimmered into existence. "It was pretty sick. Not very effective, but pretty sick." Suzuki leapt from the ledge and landed on top of Stu's sleigh. He reached down and grabbed Stu's leg, which was barely visible beneath the massing bodies of fur which covered the crypt's floor. Sandy floated down behind Suzuki and helped him pull Stu out of the river of rodents. A couple of undead rats still clung to Stu's chest hair, and Sandy knocked them off with her staff. A couple of small rats ran by, and Suzuki kicked them off the sleigh. "All right, the room isn't that small. Everyone clear a path to the walls. Take care of the big rats, and try to ignore the small ones." Stu was still pulling rats off his body. "Yeah, you try to ignore these fuckers." "You know what I mean. We clear a path and take care of the big ones, and then we can mop up the rest." "For honor! For glory! For XP!" Stu was the first one to charge in. Hardly surprising, Suzuki thought. What was surprising, though, was how efficiently Stu was doing it. He had leapt to the far side of the room and was clinging to the wall, looking down on the rats beneath him. The larger rodents were sniffing around for Stu. Even though they were undead, it seemed they still retained the basic instincts of the animal they once were. Since Stu was above the rats, they couldn't get a good look at him. Instead of jumping into the fray, he was taking pot shots at the undead vermin with his throwing knives. He had already noticeably cut down on the number of rats near him. Besides Suzuki, Sandy was twirling her staff, casting non-flammable magic missiles at the larger rodents who were fighting to crawl over their smaller brethren and overtake the little wooden island Stu had provided. Suzuki could tell that Sandy was bored. The staff didn't seem to be all that it was worked up to be. He didn't know much about it, other than that Sandy had traded away a good chunk of her loot from their last quest to get it. An undead rat soared through the air at Suzuki. He held up his shield and was able to block it in time. The rat rolled around on its back, its jaws jabbering uncontrollably, as it hissed louder than a king cobra. Suzuki impaled the rat with his sword and kicked it into the growing pile of recently extra-dead undead creatures. "How do you like the staff?" Sandy shrugged and listlessly knocked a deranged rat over the side of the sleigh. It's all right. You know, I noticed you've been kind of bored recently, with the quests." They were having a casual conversation while killing undead rats. "Look how far we've come," Suzuki mused. "It's not the quests. There are just only so many ways I can blow stuff up. I mean, look at Stu." Sandy pointed at Stu, who was hanging upside down, his face almost completely overrun by rats, hacking away while occasionally doing a sit-up and laughing maniacally. Sandy hung her head and shook it like a child disappointed by her birthday presents. "That man always finds a way to keep himself entertained." Stu grabbed one of the larger rats by its tail and swung it against the wall. The rat exploded, sending entrails and rotting flesh flying everywhere. "Hey, guys, if you grab them, they pop. Guys, check it out." Sandy sighed and hit a rat with her staff. The rat instantly incinerated, and its ashes fell in a neat clump before her feet. "Remember when I used to laugh insanely? When was the last time you heard me laughing?" Suzuki nodded. "True. It's been a while. Why don't you try something new?" "Like what?" "I don't know. You could try some of the stuff that you've been reading about." Sandy shrugged. "Everything I'm reading about is necromancy, and you can't use necromancy against things that are already undead." "Says who? Didn't Niv and Diana say that it's mostly your imagination?" "Huh. Yeah, I guess so." Suzuki thought to himself, directing his internal monologue to the eldritch imp residing in his body. "Fred, do I have enough mana for some holy spells?" The imp was roughly the size of a small man with red scales, wings, and an intimidating smile showing razor-sharp fangs. Suzuki rarely saw that, though, since Fred preferred to stay inside of Suzuki and only came out when it was necessary. Fred stretched his intangible, invisible wings and sneered in a way that made Suzuki's skin crawl from the inside. "Holy spells. If you wish to cast such banal and simple magic, yes, you do have enough mana to go hog wild, as the muscled imbecile says, and you will still be able to navigate out of this putrid place." Suzuki jabbed Sandy in the side. "May the holy waters of, light wash over you," he said, as he raised his sword in the air. Suzuki was no master of warrior mage magic, but Fred usually helped him muddle his way through those spells. He made a note to himself to ask Sandy for some books when he got back, because he was not getting the hang of freestyling spell work. Sandy laughed and smashed another rat with her staff. "Is that the best you got? That was terrible." "Why don't you show me how it's done?" Sandy raised her hands and floated higher into the air. Lightning jumped between her fingers. "Let my enemies be drowned in the depths of my power." The cavern shook, and Stu looked up from the rats he was killing. Small, swollen clouds had gathered above the rats. Rain came crashing down from the clouds. In a matter of moments, the small room began to flood. Suzuki grabbed Sandy and turned her around. "What are you doing?" Sandy tapped the side of Suzuki's neck. His skin started to itch, and he scratched it. In the open space between his armor and helmet, he could feel gills on his neck. Then she leapt over to Stu, grabbed hold of the wall, and planted a fat kiss on his neck. "Making this interesting." Stu groaned and tried to push Sandy away. "Ooh, that hurt, babe." Sandy grabbed Stu's hand and pulled him into the water before he could object. Suzuki watched them as the water continued to rise. Swimming in a pool of rotting, maggot-infested rats sounded utterly disgusting. It also sounded more fun than just hacking at them for another half an hour. However, given that he had no choice in the matter, Suzuki jumped into the water. Beneath its surface, he could see Sandy swimming back and forth. She had a mermaid's tail, and she was throwing what looked like icicle tridents at the rats, pinning them to the wall. Stu had almost forgotten about the rats. He was doing backflips underwater. Sandy was right. This was making things more interesting. The Mundanes stood around a fire in the middle of the room, tossing the bodies of the undead rats into the fire pit. The smell of charred, rotting flesh was almost unbearable, and Suzuki constantly had to work to keep himself from gagging. They had been killing for nearly an hour and were finally down to the last 3 huge rats. Stu reached down, picked a rat up, and cast it upon the fire, watching as the flames consumed the carcass, quickly reducing it to bones. Sandy raised her hands, and the flames jutted out like tendrils, engulfing the last 2 rats. "You know, that was more fun than usual, but I don't see how it's helping us get to Beth." Suzuki hid his HUD and pulled up the map of the area. A percentage of success blipped across the HUD screen. The area they were currently in read 90%. He swiped through his HUD to a map of the island. The area was darkened. There was a lack of information because it hadn't been explored. At best, it gave a vague impression of wherever Beth was. The success rate dropped to 0.007%. Suzuki shut down the HUD's map. "It doesn't look like it's helping us at all." "We need to get an army," Stu muttered. "We tried that," Suzuki growled. "And a fucking lot of good that did us. We sent all the proof we had to everyone and anyone. The repeated message, its signal, the HUD's location, everything. And what did they say?" "Fuck off," Stu muttered. "Fuck off." Suzuki pursed his lips as he mentally ran through the last conversation he'd had with them. The officer who had been patient for the first 7 times Suzuki contacted him had eventually lost his shit, saying that it was probably some orc fucking with him. "Orcs don't send emails," Suzuki had said. The officer responded by ending the call and blocking Suzuki from being able to contact him, and apparently the entire World Army. He'd been blacklisted. So had Sandy. Stu was the only one at the time who could contact them, and that was largely because he'd only tried once and, uncharacteristically, was full of yes sirs and no sirs, sitting perfectly rigid while on the phone. "Military brat," Sandy said. "His dad was a Marine." But even Stu's charms weren't enough, and eventually...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?